Our parents advocate for all of the children. Some want their children to have special treatment. Not all of our teachers want all the kids. Some want only the students who came ready to learn or who are more likely to ensure that their school is not on the state list of underperforming schools. Not all in our community place the same value on our students who attend vocational and technical programs as those in the gifted, advanced placement, and international baccalaureate programs. In the best high schools in our nation, some located right here in Memphis, we have continued to offer to some students the best education in the nation. These schools too often have entry requirements and produce graduates with scholarships to the top higher education institutions in the world. But we as a nation can no longer win internationally when a significant portion of our students cannot achieve proficiency, particularly our students of color. It's not so much the what, but the how. What I have learned over the last decade is that despite our best intentions, there are always unintended consequences to our efforts. We are not completely intentional to not just the what, but how things get implemented. It is far too easy to revert back to what is known and comfortable. Every action has a reaction, and whether we are prepared to work through that reaction matters. What we are attempting to achieve is not easy, it is not cheap, it is not quick, and it ultimately will not be sustained without focused and persistent attention on achieving the dual goals of both excellence and equity. The questions we must ask ourselves today and in the future: how do we ensure that students choosing to attend schools outside of their neighborhoods are offered the same and the full spectrum of services beyond the school day? How do we provide families that have never had school choice with the tools and skills to carefully evaluate and assess their choices and receive the information on how that school is doing? What barriers are there to choice? Transportation, racially specific charters. How do we ensure that the schools we create do not promote economic and racial segregation? In the 1980s, when Professor Ron Edmonds was working on effective schools, he wrote this: "We can, whenever and wherever we choose, successfully teach all children whose schooling is of interest to us. We can, whenever and wherever we choose, successfully teach all children whose schooling is of interest to us. We already know more than we need to do that. Whether or not we do it must finally depend on how we feel about the fact that we haven't so far." Thank you.
Please give Dr. Johnson another round of applause. Okay, at this time, and that's why we were asking the presenters to come up here, because what the task force is going to do is ask you questions about what you just talked about, or maybe some other things. So at this time, the task force will ask Dr. Johnson questions, and I'm going to ask that Maya Buggs, Attorney David Pickler, and Malik Anderson would move up to this table so that you'll be here when it's time for your presentation. Okay? Madam Chair?
Dr. Johnson, we let you go 3 minutes over. Can you hear me now? Yes. So thank you for that. I hope I saw you had copies, and I know the reporter has it, but I hope if you don't want to give them to us handwritten, you'll type them up and send them to Ms. Sweetlove.
Yes.
I know you know the history and the evolution of privatization. In your opinion, the years you served as superintendent, what was the biggest concern you had about privatization versus public funding of education?
Well, first, I just want to speak to the need to make sure that resources are equitably distributed. not just from the state to the school district, but also within the school district once it's received. So I think that there are resource needs that have to be addressed in schools where there are large numbers of very poor kids. I've worked in schools as an educator where the PTA could raise $50,000. And I've worked in schools where we raised $500 in one night, and all the money was things that teachers bought because the parents really couldn't afford those discretionary things. I think that we know from the research from Greg Duncan and Dick Murnane that in 1970, the most affluent families spent about $3,500 on their children in discretionary income, while poor families spent about $800. In, I think, 2015, the number for more affluent families had gone up to about 13,000, and poor families were able to spend about $1,200. So in addition to the money that comes from the state to the schools, some families and some communities can supplement that further, which is why it's very important to have programs like provided by Title I, where the money is distributed more to the poorest kids. And the money is going to those students based on the data that we have. Now, once you're in the district, you also have to monitor how people get the money. So one of the things that we did in Boston is we changed the formula. And it was very upsetting to some parents who had benefited from the old formula. But we counted poverty, we counted concentrations of poverty, we counted the number of ELL students you had, we counted the number of special ed students you had, and we gave schools that had the greatest need the most resources. So it's both the internal mechanisms of funding and resource distribution, as well as whether private entities end up taking money away without, let me just say, without the same accountability. So we're working to be more accountable. And so if people take public funds, they should have the same accountability as those of us who work in the traditional setting.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Any other questions?
Mr. Dodd does. Mr. Dodd.
Thank you so much, Doctor, for that outstanding presentation. I was listening intently, and it occurred to me, can you hear me? Yes. Now you can, right? Okay. I was listening intently, and I wanted to ask you, what have you found, or have you found, what's missing in teacher training? Or is there anything missing? Do you think the way in which our teachers are trained is sufficient or successful in what is happening with them? Do you find that it's better to have training before they go in the classroom or after they're there?
Well, I think quality training before is essential, but you're never going to be totally prepared for what you walk into. And I think that particularly understanding the culture of the community is very, very important. So a lot of teachers think that they have the academic knowledge, they'll pass the state test to be a teacher, and so they're assumed that because they've done that, they can teach anywhere. And the reality is, as I said before, the research from the Chicago Consortium says that in the poorest schools, we simply cannot afford people who are not robust in their academic training and their preparation. We need people who are better prepared, more prepared, and have this mindset, you know, that we can achieve. You know, I grew up, as Gloria knows, in a really small community that was very poor. I don't think any of my teachers, this was obviously before the DSEG days, any of my teachers, they told me that we could achieve.
That's right.
They expected me to perform, and that was true. That there were no, you can't memorize this because you're special ed or whatever. You were expected to perform. And so I think it's a mindset as well as an academic preparation. And then, you know, a willingness to do whatever it takes. And then, you know, I guess we've created a system where we kick some kids to the curb when they misbehave. I'm not saying our kids aren't hard to deal with, they are sometimes, but we have to figure out other solutions, because sending them home to watch video and stuff like that is not a punishment, I can promise you that.
That's right. Thank you.
Okay.
I can't stop my task number.
Just real quickly, you talked about social capital and how important social capital is. When you evaluate and assess charter schools compared to traditional public schools, how does that social capital transcend from side to side? Is one school providing more than the other, or how does that play?
Well, I'm not really in a position as a researcher to give you sort of an empirical answer to that question, because I don't know. I will say that social capital is partly about family engagement and families' capacity to connect their students, their children, to resources beyond the school day. Social capital is also making sure kids have experiences. I see a lot of schools that, and this is both on the traditional public and the charter school side, who think that it's okay to eliminate the arts, that our kids don't need these extended learning activities after school, that they don't need the engagement, that just getting them to read and write is all we should worry about. And I just beg to differ, because the most, in 1901, John Dewey said, what the best and wisest parent wants for his child,